Welcome back. I'm excited to see you again and be able to continue reading as your class's book buddy, Willa of the Woods. Let's get started in chapter 3 on page 10. Willa looked at the killing stick with dread. She'd never been seen one this close. She didn't know how they worked, but she'd watched enough hunters in her woods to know their wicked power. She'd seen deer struck dead from a distance, hawk killed in midair. During the previous winter, she'd found a wounded wolf lying on the forest floor and bandaged her wounds with healing leaves so that she could get back to her starving pups. The man lay with his eyes closed in the bed. His hands moved restlessly beside his body, touching the killing stick and the exhausted dog as he muttered in his troubled sleep. Willa knew she should go, but she also knew that some of the most valuable things in the lair would be in this very room. Into the room she crept, nothing but a shift of darkness moving through the shadows. Slipping over to the dresser, she quickly snatched half of the necklaces and earrings she found in the jewelry box, liking the weight of her satchel more and more. The little ones in her clan who didn't steal and steal well didn't get fed. It was the way the Padawan had run the clan since before she was born. If you didn't return to the lair with your satchel full, you didn't get dinner, and if it happened 2 nights in a row, you'd get worse than that. The Padawan had told her many times that the day folk were rich and didn't need their money or their belongings, and when she looked at everything the day folk had, she thought it must be true. But she also thought maybe it was better to take only half of what she found and leave the rest behind, just in case the day folk and their children were hungry too. She had stolen from many of the homesteads along this river, stealing only half of what she found, making her takings less noticeable. Move without a sound, steal without a trace. That was what she had taught herself. If the day folk were truly rich, then they wouldn't notice a few things missing come morning. Of course, she could never tell the Padawan about her rule of halves. He'd thrash her until the stream that ran beneath their lair turned red. But she was very good at stealing, and he was usually very well pleased with what her take was. She knew she was one of his favorites, and she was determined to keep it that way. Her grandmother, her Mama, whom she loved with all her heart, had told her that there had once been a time when the Farron had lived in the forest desiring nothing but what the forest could provide them. But when the homesteaders came cutting with their axes and building their candlelit homes in the woods, the Farron began to change. Their words, their wants, their ways. Sometimes when Willa was way out in the forest alone, apart from the rest of the clan, she felt the power of the forest and its creatures deep inside her, and she knew that her Mama was telling her the truth. There had been a time before. The man jerked in his sleep, snorted loudly, and took a sudden gasping breath. Willa leapt back in surprise, her limbs flooded cold with fear. But then the man mumbled something in the darkness as if he was fighting something in his dreams. The dog adjusted its position, and the two of them fell back to sleep. When Willa started breathing again, she shook her head in mocking disbelief. That dog was worthless. It couldn't smell a thing. She was right here next to him, and it didn't even know. Feeling more confident than ever, she searched the top of the dresser for more valuables. She noticed a closed black book with a long red tassel hanging down from the pages. The book had a short, single-word title that she could not read. Sitting on the book, there was a gold ring. She picked up the ring and held it up in the moonlight that shone through the window. It was one of the most beautiful dayfolk things she had ever seen. What was this gleaming thing for, she wondered. Was it magic? Noticing a glint of light out of the corner of her eye, she looked over towards the bed. The sleeping man wore an identical gold ring on the third finger of his left hand. She knew she should take the gold ring from the dresser and run as fast as she could. Take it and leave, she told herself. It had to be the most valuable thing in the lair, and it would definitely be the most valuable thing she'd ever brought back in her satchel. She could imagine the Patarine's snarling grin as she set the shining gold ring in his awaiting hands. "This is a good take, girl," he'd rasp in pleasure, all the other jaders ducking and sniveling around him, their jealousy writhing through them like poison as they snapped and hissed at her. But as she held the golden ring in her hand, a sickening feeling crept through her. She tried to convince herself that taking one of the rings wasn't breaking her rule of halves, but there was something in her that felt strangely uncertain. Sometimes two things weren't just two things. They were a pair, and a pair was a thing. Half wasn't always half, she thought. Sometimes half was whole. She didn't know what the rings were for or what they meant, but it seemed wrong to take one, to separate it from the other, like tearing a wing from a swallowtail butterfly and telling herself it could still fly. Before she could change her mind, she reluctantly slid the ring back on top of the book where she found it, and crept out of the room of the snoring man and his dim-nosed deaf dog. She moved quickly towards the next room, determined to stay focused. The next room was draped with dresses. Her heart quickened at the thought that she was going to see a Dayfolk girl up close. The girl's scent hung in the air, but there was no little girl sleeping in the room's bed. The fact that it was the middle of the night and the girl was gone seemed very strange, but Willa went over to the girl's dresser and took a shiny bracelet, a silver hairpin, several velvet ribbons, a tiny porcelain doll, and a locket. As Willa darted down to the next room, it smelled immediately of boy. She knew it was a Dayfolk boy, but it was boy all the same. On a breezy day, she could smell boys from across a meadow, whether they were Dayfolk or night. But the boy's bed was empty as well, the covers twisted onto the floor. Willa's brows furrowed. Where did the boy go? And where is the little sister girl who should have been in the previous room? And why is the man sleeping with his killing stick on his bed? "Get what you came for," she told herself, shaking her head and continuing on. They were the words she used whenever she became ensnarled in the bewildering details of the Dayfolk's life. "Get what you came for and go, Willa." She hurriedly searched through the boy's room for valuables. The first thing she found looked like a large leather glove made for a giant hand. The boy's hand must be grotesquely deformed and misshapen, she thought. Beside the glove lay a white ball and a stout wooden walking stick of some sort. The boy's legs must be crooked as well. She felt a little sorry for the boy, crippled creature, but she stuffed half of his coin collection and half of his Cherokee arrowheads into her satchel and dashed down the hall towards the fourth and final room. Get what you came for. But then her ear twitched and the quills on the back of her neck stood on end. The snoring had stopped. The man had awoken. She heard the muffled sound of movement, covers being pulled back. She felt the vibration as his feet hit the floor. "Get on up, boy," the man whispered urgently to his dog. "They're back." Willow exploded into motion. She sprinted down the length of the hallway, racing for the top of the stairs. The man charged out of his bedroom with his killing stick. Willa flashed by him, nothing but a dark streak. He must have been as startled as her, as she was by him, because he lurched back in surprise. She dove headlong down the darkened stairway, her feet barely touching the steps. But the startled man raised his weapon and aimed blindly into the dark. A flash lit the air on fire, and the sound of it shook the world. The blast struck her in the back. The force of it knocked her carrying forward. She slammed into the wall at the turn of the stairway and stumbled down the rest of the stairs like a raccoon shot from a tree. The lead shot ripped through her tunic and riddled her shoulder blade and arm. White hot lightning piercing through her body as she crashed onto the floor at the bottom of the stairway. The enraged man and his growling dog were charging down the stairway to finish her off. "Get up," she told herself, trying to find her way through the pain. "Get up, Willa, you've got to run." Chapter 4. Willa lay crumbled in the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Her right leg bent badly beneath her left. Her arm twisted under the weight of her body. Her head lay flat against the boards, blood dripping down into her eyes as she gazed out at the dead furniture and murdered walls of the shadowed lair. She could see through her eyes, and she could hear the wheeze of the air moving in and out of her lungs. But she couldn't get her arms and legs to move. The only thing she could feel was the pain of the blast radiating through her shaking body. She lay helplessly, stunned and bleeding on the floor. She felt the man's footsteps coming down the stairs behind her. His dog tore out in front of him, a blazing burst of growling teeth. The beast clamped onto her calf with its fangs, sending sharp bolts of new pain shooting through her limbs, jolting her alive. She spun around, screaming, and struck out with a quick, jerking motion. The dog pulled back, trying to drag her with its teeth, but she wrestled herself free. The snarling beast lunged in for a second bite, but Willa darted away. The dog chased her, gnashing its teeth behind her as she scurried across the eating room floor. She dove through the dog door, scrambled across the porch, and ran, fleeing out into the night, desperate to reach the safety of the forest. The man threw open the door and charged out, aiming his killing stick into the woods. Another shot exploded the world, shattering the night with a flash of light and a deafening roar as Willow scrambled away. "Get him, boy, get him," the man shouted as the dog flew off the porch after her. "I'm going to kill you this time," he screamed at her. She knew that she'd been moving so fast through the darkness of his lair that he hadn't truly seen her, but he was angry, far angrier than she'd expected from a race of beings who were supposedly so rich they didn't need most of their belongings. Get to the trees, she thought frantically as she stumbled across the grass towards the forest. But she felt dizzy and disoriented, filling with nothing but pain and panic. Her head throbbed. When that first blast hit her, she had slammed her head into the wall and then tumbled her down the stairs. Now the blood was oozing from her head down into her eyes, blurring her vision. Running nearly blind, she ducked into the first cover she came to. She scrambled into a small, closed-in place, gasping for breath and hoping the dog would pass her by. All she wanted to do was close her eyes against the pain and curl up into a little ball, but she knew if she withered there, she'd die. She wiped the blood from her eyes and tried to look around her. Had she crawled into a hollow log? Maybe she'd been lucky enough to find a fox den. But then she smelled something, and it wasn't fox. It was goat. Her heart sank. She'd made it only as far as the homesteader's barn. As she scuttled out of the pen, the startled goats ran bleating out into the yard, and the chickens flew up in a squawking explosion of feathers. Get to the forest, her mind kept telling her, but she knew it was too late. She could hear the man and his dog charging towards the building. She scurried deeper into the shadows of the barn and hunkered down to hide. A debilitating fear gripped her chest. If they ever catch you alone in their world, they will kill you, Willa, the Pattarian had told her. They cut down trees and burn with fire. They killed your sister and your parents. The barn door creaked slowly open. The flickering lights of the lantern entered first, and then the gleaming double barrels of the killing stick. The man came in slowly and cautiously. The day folk were oddly blind at night. He held up his lantern, straining to see in the dim light. His weapon pointed in front of him. Willa lay crumpled, curled up on the floor in the corner, wounded and bleeding, panting with an exhaustion so all-consuming that she couldn't move. Like a fawn that had been shot through her heart and lay on the ground, breathing her last breaths, Willa had the power of the forest animals within her, but none of her powers worked in this unnatural place. She could tell by the man's careful movements that he couldn't quite make out what type of man or beast he'd shot in the darkness and cornered in his barn. It wasn't until he raised his lantern and peered at her at close range that he got his first good look at her. She could just imagine what she must look like to him, laying in the dirt like a trapped animal in the corner of his barn, shaking with fear, her greenish arm and legs pulled up to her chest moving up and down with fast, ragged breaths, and the blood dripping down her face between her emerald green eyes. When the man finally saw her, and she lifted her eyes and looked at him, his expression changed from grim determination to utter astonishment. The viciousness that had consumed him moments before disappeared as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. She saw him realize in the light of his lantern that the thing he trapped in his barn wasn't a man or a beast. "What?" he began to ask in confusion. "What are you?" She could hear in the tremor of his voice the realization that he had shot some kind of strange little forest creature. Not just a creature, but a girl. She didn't know what he was expecting, what type of enemy he thought had invaded his lair in the dead of night. But it was not this. It was not her. Willa looked down the double barrels of the killing stick pointed at her. This man could shoot her right here and now and end it all. But all he had to do was pull the trigger. Or he could strangle her with his bare hands or strike her in the head with a shovel. Without the powers of the forest, she could not defend herself from him. She was helpless. But as she looked into his face, she saw something that she did not think was possible in a Dayfolk man. Kindness. I don't understand," he said in bewilderment. "Where did you come from? Who are you?" "I'm Willa," she thought, but she did not answer his question out loud. The Padawan had brought the English sounds into their clan long before she was born, and she knew the sounds well enough to understand him. But whether she was using the old language or the new, Willa spoke to trees, not the men who killed them. How could day ever comprehend night? How could darkness ever know light? How could she say her name to a man such as this? "Just hold on," he said gently, watching her with steady eyes as he knelt beside her trembling body. He set the killing stick and the lantern down on the dirt floor of the barn. All the anger and fear that had consumed him moments before seemed to have disappeared from him now. So wickedly fast these humans seemed to change their spirit. "I'm going to take a look at the wound," he said as he pulled a white cloth from his pocket and moved towards her, though he was going to try to stanch the bleeding. But he was human. She knew she could not trust him. She stayed perfectly still. She didn't move in any way as his hand came closer and closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. The moment he touched her, she sprang to her feet. Startled, he pulled back in surprise. She darted past him. The dog snapped at her, but missed. With her last burst of dying energy, she dashed through the doorway of the barn and out into the darkness. She ran across the grass. The moment she reached the edge of the forest, she blended into the night and disappeared. The last thing she had heard him say as he grabbed his lantern and his killing stick was, "Come on, boy, we're going after her." Thanks for tuning back in. Next time we'll pick up at chapter 5. See you later.